Good afternoon, and my name is Giorgio Marfella. I'm a senior lecturer here at the MSD, and I'll be chairing this second session, which is titled State Solutions. So we'll take now a state-focused approach, and we have three interesting case studies. And the first one is from Professor Philip GOAD, who will talk about Victoria and the homes on their backs, Operation Snail and the Victorian Precut housing project. Philip.
So my paper this afternoon explores the design, construction and mixed political fortunes of the Victorian Precut housing project, better known as Operation Snail. Like a military exercise and drawing criticism as such, Operation Snail came at a time in Australia's post-World War II history, when the desire nationally for improved infrastructures of defence, power, transport and water coincided with dire shortages in labour, materials and housing. It exemplifies one case amongst many at that time of government agencies stepping in and acting decisively to relieve a crisis in housing access and affordability. On the 23rd of March 1948, the Melbourne Argus reported that the Minister for Transport in Thomas Holway's Liberal Country Party coalition Victorian state government, Colonel Wilfred Kent Hughes on the left, had submitted a proposal to Arthur Calwell on the right, Federal Minister for Immigration in the Chifley Labor government. And his proposal was for 1,000 English railwaymen, their families and 1,000 prefabricated homes to be brought to Victoria for the new South Morwell brown coal project in Gippsland. Kent Hughes even floated the idea that these 1,000 English migrants be transported to Australia on an aircraft carrier, along with 1,000 prefab aluminium Churchill homes. While at first rejected federally and appearing somewhat outlandish, the idea took root. 3 months later, Kent Hughes pushed the matter further. Working with the Victorian Agent General in London, he called for a report from British prefabricated and British and European house manufacturers, including one already exporting prefabs to southern Rhodesia. He then forced the issue at a Premier's conference in Canberra and gained direct approval from Prime Minister Ben Chifley. It was announced that new suburbs would be established for railway workers near workshops in Newport, Ballarat and Bendigo. The imported prefabs would be free of customs duty and sales tax, and their use extended to soldier settlers, country teachers and their families. In September 1948, Kent Hughes and master builder J.W. Chalmers travelled to London to investigate prefabs, and there they were joined by two young Melbourne architects, Lloyd Orton and Tony Armstrong, who acted as ministerial advisors to Kent Hughes. But Kent Hughes also had another agenda. In addition to investigating prefabs, he was going to negotiate for supplies of coal, steam engines and labour in the form of migrants, as well as recruiting teachers and investigating the latest ideas in school building. Along the way, he bought in India 100,000 tonnes of coal and 120,000 tonnes of British coal. In response to coal shortages, strikes and limited supply from New South Wales and making political mileage, Kent Hughes announced from London, and I quote, "If the communists refuse to unload the coal or the houses, the government will take adequate steps to see that there is no holdup." Kent Hughes and his team examined every type of available British prefab and found none suitable. As a result, tenders were called for a timber frame prefab suitable to Victorian conditions and with a life expectancy of at least 50 years. Contractors from Sweden, Austria and Italy flew to London to compete with British manufacturers for what was now termed for the first time as Operation Snail. Kent Hughes predicted that if the scheme was economically successful, he envisaged migrants taking houses on their backs to every Australian state. By October 1948, the Victorian government approved the purchase of 1,000 precut timber homes from the Nottingham firm of W.J. Sims, Son and Cook, with an order quickly increased to 2,000. It was reported as Britain's biggest individual house export contract. A panel of Victorian architects, similar to that operating within the Housing Commission of Victoria, was appointed. Yuncken, Freeman Brothers, Griffiths and Simpson, and Baxter Cox and Associates were selected. Kent Hughes announced that the former, that's Yuncken, Freeman Brothers, Griffiths and Simpson, had experience with pre-cut buildings during World War II. Roy Simpson, he's there second from the right, and Otto, or Rob Yuncken, by the time this photograph is taken, he died, I'm afraid, but Otto Yuncken, both had been recruited to the US Army Services of Supply and had worked for the US Army Corps of Engineers designing camps and field hospitals. Even before the war's end, on the left, Yuncken had penned an article with illustrations by Roy Simpson, suggesting that pre-cut timber surplus army huts could be converted to temporary dwellings before their ultimate replacement with permanent homes. Simpson's drawings that you see there on the left show houses strikingly similar to those eventually that were known as Operation Snail. Cleverly, Yuncken and Simpson had retained within the office a USA SOS drawing set as a suitable model for developing a documentation manual in the future. So with the project in hand, Roy Simpson took the lead. A basic plan of a 2-bedroom house was developed with allowance for expansion to 3 and 4 bedrooms, and the result was 44 different external designs, with 11 designs allocated for each cardinal direction, all of which reflected the flexibility of their adopted system. Each house had a timber frame of imported Baltic pine, pre-cut in Nottingham and clad in interlocking pre-cut vertical boards rather than conventional weatherboards. Every framing member was exactly sized, notched and checked so the erection could take place without any measuring, cutting or fittings. Light timber trusses at 6-foot centres automatically aligned and locked the whole structure together. Roofs were to be clad in asbestos cement tiles or special interlocking Cookson aluminium sheeting. Imported too were stainless steel sinks, gas and electric stoves, dish drying racks, ventilated cupboards and joinery. So too all the bathroom items, including copper plumbing, taps, hot water service, mirror cabinets and rubber surface flooring, and of course all nails and screws. All plumbing could be screwed into place by one man in one day. The harness electric wiring, designed and made in Australia and pre-cut to length, similar to that used in cars and aircraft, was simply unrolled in the roof space. The drawings resembled a set of manufacturing instructions, and for construction, traditional plans and specifications were replaced by erection manuals. Each house bundle was indexed, tabbed, and on arrival in Melbourne was delivered to a huge wartime wool store in Brooklyn in West Footscray. Locally supplied items were also delivered to this same store so that all components for each house could be issued centrally to builders for assembly. From the Brooklyn warehouse, house bundles were delivered to site where orthodox foundations had been prepared in advance. Each house was designed with a central spine wall. This and the outside walls were framed first, thus forming a skeleton structure of 2 long compartments. Roof framing and cladding came next, so that all further work could proceed under cover. Floor and ceiling boards, pre-cut to exact length, were fitted next, and interior partitions slipped between. All wall dimensions were based on the multiple of the width of a plasterboard sheet. By September 1949, Kent Hughes expanded the remit of the Victorian pre-cut housing project. He was also Minister for Electrical Undertakings. He ordered 450 more Operation Snail houses, 150 for the new Mount Beauty Township, for workers on the Kiwa hydroelectric power scheme, 300 for a new settlement adjacent to Newborough for English migrants working on extensions to the Yallourn Sea Powerhouse, scheduled for operation in 1952. It was late though. And a further 300 were ordered by the State Rivers and Water Supply Commission for the new township of Eildon, bringing the total to 1,750 houses. In December of 1949, components of the first 16 houses arrived in Melbourne, and the first house was erected in Sunshine in mid-February. with an estimated 600 to be built in the Braybrook Shire, 80 at Williamstown, and the remainder of the 1,000 initial order, 250, to be erected in regional Victoria. Robin Boyd, as we've heard, says everything truthfully, director of the Aged Small Home Service and co-editor with Roy Simpson. Boyd and Simpson were very good friends. He was co-editor with Roy Simpson of the student pamphlet Smudges. He reviewed the new pre-cut houses. Boyd was positive. His only gripe was that the poorest thing in the ample kitchen is the small Australian stove. And he noted, and I quote, "There's no hint of their pre-cut origin, nothing to suggest unorthodox construction." But even before large numbers of Operation Snail houses had been completed, there was criticism. In early 1950, politicians were bickering over State Minister for Housing Arthur Warner's announcement that 5,000 prefabs were to be imported to complement the Housing Commission's local prefab providers, such as the Holmes Glen concrete house plant that we've heard of before, and also, as Miles mentioned, G.A. Winwood's prefab timber house factory at Sandringham. Best Overend, a member of the Commission's architects panel, told the minister at an inspection of 3 imported houses assembled at Sandringham that a wartime landing in the Pacific was simple compared with the proposed import and erection of 5,000 prefabricated houses. Kent Hughes, no longer a member of Victorian Parliament, weighed in publicly. He argued that with Operation Snail, the Railways Department and the SEC and their architects, combined with English brains, had already shown the Housing Commission how this job could be done. But Kent Hughes's confidence was countered by local opinion. Braybrook councillors were outraged that the Housing Commission would propose 1,000 imported prefabs for its new Maidstone estate, complaining that the Victorian Railways had not submitted plans or consulted with council officers. Councillor Dobson believed that their prefabs, this is Operation Snail, and I'm quoting here, their prefabs were the worst type of house that had been erected in the area in the past 26 years. And another said that, and I quote, he would much sooner see houses from the Holmes Glen factory than what he called dog boxes from overseas. This seesawing of opinion was divided along professional and political lines. In June 1950, architect Neil Clarahan, like Boyd, reviewed positively 2 groups of pre-cut houses in Wright Street and Balla Road in Sunshine on the left, noting the 8-foot ceilings as the international standard, and the houses' colour schemes of battleship grey, barn red, sage green, suntan, and, of course, curdled cream. Those are Clarahan's words. But when ministers of the new Country Party-led state government visited the SEC's Operation Snail houses at Newborough, they described them as future slums, which will be falling down in 10 years. And they were apparently shocked at the cost, size and quality of these dwellings. And they also visited Victorian-built timber prefabs supplied through the Housing Commission, which were cheaper and which they found to be, and I quote, vastly better than Operation Snail homes. As ever, Kent Hughes went on the offensive, defending the outcome and quoting expert architectural opinion. The architecture profession too responded. The RVIA president, Keith Mackay, defended Operation Snail houses with a terse response, and Neil Clarahan reiterated strong arguments against the outburst of uninformed criticism surrounding the scheme, but also prefabricated housing generally. This flurry of comment went quiet as the first 8 British families arrived in Melbourne on the 1st of August 1950. In houses on Hertford Street in Sunshine, where they were to stay for the first 2 weeks, they found food on the shelves, kindling to light fires, and fully furnished interiors. The first families to move into these so-called receiving houses were travel-weary and a little bewildered, but overwhelmed by the warmth of Australian hospitality and help. Jim Whittaker, formerly a cowman on a Leamington at Spa Midlands estate where he, his wife and their 3-year-old daughter Laurie had lived in a 200-year-old cottage on the estate, were thrilled. And there's Mrs. Whittaker's response to the kitchen. While the Australian Women's Weekly article was clearly a publicity stunt for the scheme, No negative press accounts before or after countered views like these from residents. By April 51, 50 of a projected 300 Operation Snail houses had been occupied at the new township of Eildon, built to house workers on the Eildon Dam, being constructed by the Utah Construction Company of California. By May, 61 Operation Snail precuts had been allocated to the country towns of Ararat, Seymour, Traralgon, Morwell, Warragul, Moe and Currumbara. More were ordered for Portland, Wodonga and suburban Fairfield. By the end of June 1951, the Victorian Railways Commissioners recorded production of over 3,000 houses, comprising 1,500 for the Victorian Railways, 975 for the State Electricity Commission, 300 for State Rivers and Water Supply Commission at Eildon, 9 for the Melbourne Harbour Trust, and 300 for the Commonwealth Works and Housing Department. This latter group of houses for the Commonwealth specifically aimed at British migrant miners brought out to Australia to increase the output of coal for steel and other industries. But just 2 months later, in August 1951, R.G. Weishart, Chief Railways Commissioner, announced that 2 of its staff were travelling to West Germany to recruit 3,000 railway workers for Victoria, and that the Department of Railways would end its Operation Snail migrant housing project. The migrant pool in Britain was reported as being almost exhausted, and the first batch of West Germans would arrive before the end of 1951. But it was specifically announced there would not be the incentive of housing coming with them on their backs. Operation Snail in Victoria had, it seemed, been a very British-focused operation. While Victoria ceased orders for new Operation Snail houses, it still had large numbers of house bundles stockpiled. The Commonwealth Department of Works and Housing purchased 300 precut houses for the coal and steel workers' villages of Dapto, Unanderra and Bulli near Wollongong in New South Wales. 50 Operation Snail houses were erected at Kapulka and Wagga for defence purposes, 100 at Puckapunyal in central Victoria, and 50 at the Holsworth military camp in southwest Sydney. As material shortages eased by 1952 and size restrictions on individual houses were lifted, the urgency of Operation Snail would seem to have passed. Migration would continue apace for the next 2 decades, but housing provision would largely revert to local provision. The moniker Operation Snail had also become common parlance and was applied to other imported house schemes. And for people like Boyd, who we see quoted here, it also became a benchmark of quality. What distinguishes the Operation Snail scheme today as a phenomenon of prefabrication was its speed and the elegance and simplicity of its design and delivery through local expertise. There is little doubt that it met a need, yet the significance of the Victorian precut housing project should not be overestimated. As a phenomenon, it sits within a larger post-war project of extraction and the securing of infrastructure, energy and power to industrialise Australia after World War II, and the accommodation of a largely migrant labour force, in this case, largely British labour force. What is clear is that prefabricated houses were part of that agenda, but only for so long as it was necessary to secure a labour force, and only for so long as it took for the building industry to recover after the enforced austerities of World War II were removed. After that, it was simply a return to business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. The next speaker is Dr. Julie Collins, and Julie's coming here from the University of South Australia. And the paper that Julie will present is the South Australian Housing Trust's post-war experiments with prefabricated housing systems.
Since its establishment in the 1930s, the South Australian Housing Trust gained importance as the housing arm of the South Australian Government. And when coupled with Premier Thomas Playford's focus on industrialisation for post-war recovery, the idea of the factory-built home seemed an ideal solution. My talk today will examine the introduction of ideas around prefabricated housing in South Australia by the Housing Trust, with a focus on the prototype concrete all-it homes and reasons behind the failure of the Trust to build more of these. The South Australian Housing Trust was established in 1936 and was authorised to provide affordable housing for rent and purchase. In 1937, it held competitions to find designs, with the winning design in traditional double brick with corrugated iron roof and timber windows reproduced across the state for decades to come. The Housing Trust model contracted local builders to construct homes to trust plans. SA's exposure to the economic impacts of the Great Depression and the resulting impact on housing supply and affordability extended into the late 1930s, when, with the outbreak of World War II, conditions worsened, with shortages of materials and labour and government-imposed restrictions. By 1947, after a decade in existence, the Housing Trust had contributed almost 3,000 homes across the state, but pressure was gathering for more output. South Australian housing had traditionally been of stone or brick, most often locally made red brick, supplied by brickmakers such as Shearings and Hallett. Unable to keep up with the increasing demand following the war, alternatives were sought, including Mount Gambier limestone and cement blocks. Premier Playford saw opportunities for manufacturing growth and encouraged local, national and international businesses to set up factories in SA. In 1948, on a visit to the UK and Europe, Playford took meetings to promote South Australian interests, in particular on methods of speeding up the house building rate, including a visit to a brickmaking plant on the Isle of Man. Playford was most interested in what he saw as the oversupply of bricks in the UK due to the use of prefabricated timber construction for homes there, and the possibility of UK brick suppliers setting up production in South Australia. Notably, Playford held a long interview with Victor Ramsden, Managing Director of All It Limited, which specialised in prefabricated concrete buildings, a meeting which, according to All It, was promising and left them with an impression that this new market would be open for them. All It Limited specialised in prefab concrete buildings, using a system which had been developed by architect Edwin Katona. The company, founded in 1940, was known for its wartime concrete hutments. It diversified into housing, flats and schools, and by 1949 had built 11,000 homes across the UK. The All It system was promoted in the Architects Journal in 1945, being praised as, and I quote, "Its standardisation lies only in the units and not in a fixed house type. This allows extreme flexibility in design and leaves plenty of scope for the architect's imagination," end quote. The All It system comprised precast reinforced concrete frames with cavity walls held in position by the columns of the frame. The frame was bolted together using steel plates cast into the ends of columns and by the pouring of a small amount of concrete into the cavities at the ends of the column brackets and beams, which contained overlapping steel reinforcement. The wall slabs were described as lightly reinforced to prevent breakage during handling and were of 2-foot modules for planning and fenestration reasons. It was claimed that the cost in the UK in 1945 was £1 per square foot. Prior to the 1920s, Gloag and Wernham, in their 1946 book, House Out of the Factory, record that only 4 systems of concrete prefabricated houses had reached an output of 10,000 dwellings. These were the Boots Pier and Panel, Duo Slab, Fiedler and Winget systems. And these were not in use after the 1920s. Subsequently, the Beaucrete and All It systems were developed, which Gloag and Wernham note, quote, employed a precast concrete frame and a double skin panel facing. They also noted that while in the UK there was a preponderance of concrete masonry systems, American models, however, displayed, quote, a much more adventurous use of the material, with the most successful system commercially being that of a channel-shaped 1-storey high units from 1 foot to 4 foot wide. Aulet had used the 1948 meeting with Playford as leverage nationally in Australia, citing it in extensive correspondence with the Australian Government's Division of Industrial Development. This led to a trip by Aulet's Victor Ramsden in 1949 to visit Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia and Western Australia. Aulet sought to form partnerships with existing Australian building businesses who would each pay a fee for the intellectual property of the Aulet system and purchase the equipment to pour the precast units. The sales pitch in these letters is insistent, and Aulet also included illustrated pamphlets about their technology, housing and school buildings. On his trip to Australia, Ramsden, the manager of Aulet, met with the Housing Trust architect Eric Dowitz, who was about to embark on an international research tour to the UK and Europe to investigate concrete as a building material for housing, including no fines, aerated and pre-stressed systems, as well as prefabricated and panelled houses. Tellingly, before Dowitz even left, it had been announced in the press that, and I quote, "As soon as possible after his return, tenders will be invited for a large number of concrete homes." On his return, Dowitz reported that most English people were convinced that prefabricated or non-traditional house was the coming thing, and in time it would oust the traditional home. However, he also pronounced that housing using non-traditional construction methods and materials would be uneconomical in SA when compared with traditional brick building methods and materials. This was the official line as well. In the Housing Trust's 1950 annual report, it stated that, quote, "Taking into account of all the requisites of a large-scale house building scheme, it would seem that there are no unorthodox building methods and materials which in South Australia would be an improvement on the orthodox clay bricks, stone and cement used in accordance with proved technical modern methods." Yet on the same page of the report, the Trust announced a contract for 750 concrete homes by Aulet SA Construction Limited, involving a large measure of prefabrication in a factory, which was to be set up in the state. The houses were to be of 2 stories in pairs, and work was to have begun by the end of 1950, with the rate of building expected to exceed 5 houses per week. The contract was for 3 years, beginning in 1950, and would grow to a contract of 1,000 units by 1951. By September 1950, Jack Cartledge, chairman of the Trust, reported that the Trust has in mind large-scale construction of concrete homes, and Trust architect Dowitz again travelled to Europe to study the construction. This was in parallel with the Trust's exploration of timber imported housing, and followed a visit earlier in the year to Melbourne by Dowitz to examine homes, a trip to California in June to inspect mass-produced homes, and to England to supervise the erection of a prototype Carwood Horton designed timber home for the Trust. He also visited Sweden and Holland on that trip. The hopes for prefabricated reinforced concrete homes were high, with the suggestion that Aulet would be able to construct 1 per day. 2 companies were set up, one to prefabricate the components and one to construct the buildings. Builder Henry Wilkins of Wilkins and Burnside Builders was the chair of Aulet SA and travelled overseas to interview Aulet personnel. Wilkins met with David Feeney, manager of Aulet in Belfast at the Aulet factory, and employed him to become the manager of the SA operation, with Feeney moving from Ireland in November 1950 to oversee works. On arrival in Adelaide, Feeney recalled his first job was to produce accurate costings for homes, and found that in comparison to the original indication Aulet UK had provided, and I quote from an interview by Feeney in 1980, "There was a huge hole in the amount. There were interminable arguments as to whether I was right or wrong, and the problem was posed to Jack Cartledge and Alec Ramsey, who were terribly, terribly upset. You see, because the first contract was to be for 1,000 homes, and that's a lot of houses. At a contract price per each, in our form of construction, the question, what else could we do, was posed to me," end quote. Feeney knew that in Northern Ireland, 60 to 65% of the cost was for the factory-produced components, the precast high-grade reinforced concrete elements, wall units, stanchions, main beams and secondary beams, as well as the outside cladding and roofing material. The prefabrication factory to make these was sited on land at Grand Junction Road at Kilburn, with a proposed site for the erection of the Orlet homes to be at neighbouring Blair Athol. As a proof of concept, in 1951, Orlet SA constructed a 2-storey block of 4 homes using prefabricated concrete panels. Feeney later called it one of the best engineering exercises in South Australia. Standing on Grand Junction Road at Blair Athol, it was handed over to the Housing Trust in November 1951, with the Premier in attendance. It was described in the local press as a semi-detached and using a form of construction developed in the UK known as the Ulster Cottage. Trust Chairman Jack Cartledge explained that these had been erected for examination by the Trust, and if approved, most houses in the contract for 1,000 homes will be constructed under this method. With 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, bathroom and external laundry, the homes were entered via a shared hallway centrally located, with 2 homes upstairs and downstairs. This construction system, the construction system used appears to have been modified in comparison to the UK system, so that rather than the 2-foot medium-sized modular panels comprising the wall's external and internal skins, full-height wall panel slabs were used for the external skin. These were precast with openings for windows and surface penetrations and ranged from 9 foot high by 5 foot wide to 9 foot high by 1 foot wide. Internally, plasterboard was used as linings and fixed to a timber stud wall frame. Floors, both ground and first, and roof structure were framed in timber. After it was handed over, as Feeney recalled, and I quote, "Then came the question of costing." He remembered Chairman Jack Cartledge's response. He didn't give a damn what the houses were made of, providing they would be reasonably permanent and he could get them fast enough. So I had to put up other schemes for him, and eventually I got the contract, which were mostly concrete block work in traditional fashion. When asked if all its precast reinforced concrete design was practical, Feeney replied, "Oh yes, always was. It was the price. You can't make anything in the factory that's cheaper than the traditional method. Once you cart all your stuff to the factory and you set up moulds and you tool up, as we term it, to make these units, and you transport from here to there, it's got to be dearer than the standard mode of building." The quadruple unit at Blair Athol, seen here, stood until 2008, when it was sold and demolished as the suburb underwent renewal. When the quadruple unit had originally been handed over in 1951, another 12 homes by Orlet were handed over too. These, however, were concrete block, traditionally constructed, and were promoted as concrete homes. But the Orlet story took another further interesting turn, following the abandonment of the precast quadruple unit idea, with a pivot to timber-framed sheeted dwellings. Still constructed under the Orlet SA Company banner, traditionally constructed homes, be they in timber or concrete block, were to make up the remainder of the contracted houses. Looking at the Housing Trust reports, it can be seen that other prefabricated building providers were entering the Housing Trust books, with names like Carwood, Wharton and Co, H. Newsom and Sons of the UK, Wender and Duerholt, and the Overseas Construction Company, both of Germany, also appearing. In the years between March 1950 and June 1954, some 3,832 timber frame houses were imported from overseas, both for rental and for purchase from the Trust. Orlet would continue to operate in Australia and would later build in the Northern Territory, both before and after Cyclone Tracy, with its name continuing into the 21st century under the A.V. Jennings Group. Its concrete homes in the UK, while said to be permanent dwellings in its promotional material of the 1940s, were condemned in the 1980s and many were demolished. The imperative to be seen to be keeping up with overseas trends appears to have led to a need to, at the very least, experiment with precast concrete techniques in South Australia, despite experts' opinions that they may not work out to be economically viable. That being said, giving up on the prefabricated solution before it got into full production can be seen to have somehow defeated any opportunity it may have had to prove itself in the first place. Thank you.
So my name is MARYIA RUSAK, and I'm generally a postdoc at ETH Zurich. I'm joining in today from the Netherlands, where I have been presenting actually this very similar paper at a different conference on urban history and design. So I will just delve into this. So a Courier Mail article from the 27th of April, 1954, described a freshly completed suburb about 10 miles west of Brisbane, Australia. Inala, which means place of peace in Aboriginal, is really a place of peace. Inala is an all-electric suburb, once known as Silverstone. The suburb is a housewife's delight, with hot water, a wash boiler, a stove, in fact, everything on electricity. There is a plot of ground about 1/4 of an acre to each house, and the soil will grow just about anything, which gives the man of the house plenty to do in his spare time. End of quote. Indeed, Inala, a 1950s suburb planned according to the Garden City principles, was to serve both as an example and a testing ground for the post-war Australian ideology of domestic bliss. Nested within a former bushland, it was to provide affordable modern housing and contain all the amenities needed: grocery stores, shops, churches, schools, and shop centers, within easily accessible bus and rail services connecting to larger Brisbane. Its lived reality, however, differed from the visions of its creators. The suburb's many historical layers represent an accumulation of different urban design and building models as they traveled across different continents. The paper then suggests to consider Inala not as yet another instance of post-war suburban planning, but rather as a project of urban design. By dissecting and tracing its many plans, housing typologies, networks of material and labor involved in its construction, the paper places the project of Inala within broader contemporary debates around immigration, material circulation, affordability, and sustainability. In doing so, the paper offers not just a historiographical, but a methodological contribution, sketching new ways of writing histories of urban design projects. So, an Aboriginal land settled in the late 19th century, Inala's 20th century history dates back to the American Camp Freeman, established in the woodlands for non-white American soldiers who provided labor and transport services during the Second World War. Parcels of land were cleared for temporary tent lines and huts, but were deserted shortly after the war. By May 1946, the huts were occupied by returning Australian servicemen and their families in dire need of housing. Dramatic displacements and turmoil of the Second World War aggravated the already complicated Australian housing situation. Thousands of families lived in makeshift shelters made from calico, canvas, and hessian. In the absence of comprehensive state-led programs, grassroots initiative flourished. Hogg Davis, a returning serviceman demobilized in 1945, could not rent or build a house and set up to form a housing cooperative for returning soldiers. A cooperative named Silverstone would occupy the grounds of the former American camp. In 1947, the society bought 344 hectares of land and commissioned a Sydney architectural firm of Hennessy and Hennessy to design the master plan. The architect's firm has previously worked on large cathedral projects in Brisbane and Sydney and designed the Grand St. Lucia campus of the University of Queensland. The original 1947 Silverstone plan was designed according to the tradition of the Garden City movement to create a, quote, spacious and healthy housing estate. It was to provide more than 2,000 homes and include a range of public facilities: churches, schools, theaters, shops, parks, sporting ovals, swimming baths, playgrounds, and childcare centers. With an overall cost of over £3 million, it was to become, quote, a model, self-contained little city, at least equal in beauty and convenience to any other in the world, end of quote. The plan featured a grand entrance to 132 feet wide main avenue lined with trees. The residential areas followed the higher contours, while lower areas were to be preserved as parks with creeks, paths, trees, and ferns. The project's green spaces were an integral part of the Brisbane City Council Green Belt plans. A share in the cooperative would entitle one to select a home site in the area, receive a freehold deed for the site, and build a home according to one's design. In August 1949, groundwork started with bulldozers clearing over 850 acres. However, the cooperative was not able to raise the necessary funds. Was not able to raise the necessary funds. A year later, only 7 homes were in fact constructed. Plagued by persistent shortage of building materials and means, the society sold the land to the Queensland Housing Commission, and that opened a second chapter. The Queensland Housing Commission was a new state agency formed in the end of 1945 as a part of the broader Commonwealth-led effort to mitigate the immediate post-war housing crisis. The Commission was responsible for all new public housing. No Australian family was expected to pay more than a fifth of their weekly income in rent. With additional pressure from the state-led initiatives that encouraged the immigration of European labor, there was a pressing need to build large amounts of housing quickly and cheaply. Differently from a grassroots cooperative, the Commission benefited from operations of large scale. Original master plans from Hennessy and Hennessy were expanded with more land and simplified amenities. Silverstone was no longer a garden city, but a satellite town with parks, recreational centers, and schools. When completed, the suburb housing 4,000 families would be the 9th largest city in Queensland. However, the question remained, how to raise such a large development given the dramatic situation of the post-war Australian construction market? Perpetual shortages of all building materials and qualified labor in Australian post-war construction prompted ample discussions on the most suitable building types and a broad search for solutions abroad. In 1949, a year before the similar Commonwealth initiative, the Queensland Housing Commission assembled a trade mission that scoured Europe for private companies to help meet the immense housing backlog. The state government decided to import prefabricated timber houses from Europe with a $300 per unit subsidy to meet the costs of deliveries and import. The the Commission examined tenders from 200 firms and manufacturers from Great Britain, France, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Holland, Belgium, Italy, and Greece. Most original submissions were deemed uniform box-like structures and were rejected. Instead, the Commission insisted that prefabricated houses for Queensland had to be designed according to the Commission's own plans, similar to the locally constructed homes. In March 1950, contracts were signed for 2,500 timber houses from France, Sweden, and Italy, delivered respectively from Le Cochefre, Mokonge Trehus, and Lenyami Pasotti. All in all, the Commonwealth envisioned importing 20,000 houses in 1951 and 40,000 houses in subsequent years. Queensland was among the first Australian states to sign contracts for imported timber houses. Large-scale planning particularly benefited from prefabrication. Wholesale orders meant that the pressing housing need could be alleviated quickly and dramatically lowered the costs. Prefabricated houses came as a complete package, an important aspect considering the shortage of local building materials, from nails to bricks, cement, roofing iron, terracotta tiles, and timber. For the European producers, bulk orders capped the unused capacity and, if successful, promised lucrative business partnerships in the future. The contractors were also to carry out all the works associated with the project, including foundations, fittings, and infrastructure and supply. One of the most important conditions set forth by the Commonwealth Committee during early negotiations was that the European contractors would also send their laborers together with the houses. This requirement confirmed the interest of the companies from countries with a surplus of building labor, so Sweden and Italy. The Commonwealth Migration Department was to provide a special dispensation to facilitate immigration for the project and screen all workmen on arrival to ensure the necessary level of skill and union affiliation. European contractors were to erect houses according to the Commonwealth plans and specifications, adjusted for the local climate conditions. Imported Surveston houses consisted of 336 two-bedroom types, 1,000 three-bedroom types, and 111 four-bedroom houses that varied in elevation and roof design. The houses were based on a timber frame structure, a common building material in Queensland. However, given Australia's radically different climate conditions, timber had to be thoroughly examined to ensure its suitability and structural soundness. On the outside, houses were sheeted with chamfer boards and weatherboards, or tiles of asbestos cement. Roofing was done with asbestos cement in 3 different colors and 22-gauge corrugated aluminum alloy. 16 color schemes were used to break up the monotony of a large housing estate, and timber houses from different producers were interspersed with brick and concrete buildings by local producers. Overall, as the Housing Commission took over the suburb, its design departed from the original visions of a monumental garden city, instead shaped by the post-war scarcity of the Australian building industry. Without local producers to deliver such a large project, the Commission imported the entire housing estate from Europe. Although a seemingly logical solution to quickly alleviate the pressing housing need, this decision opened the door to the many unexpected structural and design issues and shaped the lived reality of the suburb for the years to come. So the first prefabricated houses and European labourers started to arrive in Queensland ports in the spring of 1951. 2 aircraft carriers brought 1,000 prefabricated timber elements to Brisbane, where 76 trucks were loaded daily to deliver the elements on site. As one of the workers remembered, quote, "The trucker would arrive with a paper asking for A, B, C, or D, the 4 variations of house style, and the kit would be loaded up. The organization was excellent," end of quote. In July 1951, the Brisbane Telegraph reported that since the start of the construction a month ago, blocks of the first 140 homes had been set up, and houses were in different stages of construction. The Australian Housing Minister, Mr. Hilton, and the State Housing Commissioner, Mr. Gavin, visited the estate in July 1951. They were so pleased that, quote, 2 hours later, that had left by air for overseas to buy more prefabricated houses, end of quote. Imported prefabrication technologies sped up the housing assembly to the extent that roads and services lagged behind, causing public criticism regarding the Commission's expanding strategy. The first homes were occupied already by August, and new residents, quote, moved even before the final coat of paint was dry. Visions of qualified migrant labor force did not quite live up to the reality, and the well-developed prefabrication system was particularly handy. For example, as one of the workers, Gus Salvini, remembered, quote, "The houses went together like a jigsaw. You only needed a hammer and a bag of nails, which was good because the men they brought out as workers were nearly all farmers," end of quote. The work was performed by workmen of many nationalities who hardly spoke English, and the instructions often required interpreters. Those with professional education became gang leaders, and the assembly was organized in rotational groups. It would take about a week to complete a house from scratch. The Housing Commission had to accept the situation, which required on-site corrective work. Workers received an extra country allowance for work located in a place without amenities, making the jobs quite attractive. For example, the Italian contractor paid 3 times the minimum wage. Local contractors also benefited from the surplus of cheap foreign labor. For example, Jack Boss, an owner of the Adelaide construction company, Bose Brothers, commissioned for other houses in Surveston, remembered, "Whenever the Fair Sky or the Fair Seas, the names of ships, came into port, The Italian immigrants would come straight out to the suburb knowing there was work here. Boss Brothers delivered 1,000 cast-in-place concrete houses built with readily available local aggregates. 5 houses could be poured each week, and the houses were deemed pleasing in appearance and design. As European contractors experienced more and more financial problems, Australian Boss Brothers was the only firm that completed all of the contract houses on time. So in Surviston, renamed to Inala in 1952, European housing typologies were mixed with the local construction in concrete. Adjusted immigration laws also benefited the local contractors, as cheap migrant labor allowed the Housing Commission to deliver on its promise of affordable modern housing. For many, moving to Inala was akin to moving into paradise. The suburb, with its modern amenities, offered an affordable version of the post-war domestic bliss of home, happiness, marriage, and morality. According to Carola Robson, one of Inala's residents, for the people who came to Inala in the 50s and 60s, there were 3 great positives in their lives. There was peace, there was full employment, and thanks to the Housing Commission, they had a roof over their heads. Despite the Commission's houses being perhaps far from the prosperity of the upper middle class, they provided affordable modernity for those who struggled for years to find a place to live. Many were desperate to move in, and many immigrant laborers assembling the houses found their first Australian homes there. The State Commission responded to the criticism, saying that only a biased person would claim that the imported houses do not afford facilities equal to the standard of the great majority of suburban homes. But for the erection of those houses, these families, who are very comfortably housed, would have had to continue to live in temporary housing, substandard buildings with in-laws, or in overcrowded conditions. Overall, Inala was a project where local and imported layers of typologies overlapped, not without problems. Garden City references remained only in the street names and in the vast patches of bushlands, while only parts of the original architect's plan could be recognized in the street curvature. The land was transformed rapidly, and lowland areas posed complex problems of drainage, wild animals, and mosquitoes. The most radical, however, emerged from the unexpected non-human actor. The pine of Italian, French, and Swedish timber houses was infested with a European borer that did not just survive but flourished in the Australian climate.
Maria, sorry.
Traveling up and
are you almost finished? We're running out of time.
Yes, I'm very much almost finished. Traveling up and down pieces of timber, the borer caused severe structural damage in many imported houses, leading to a massive fumigation program. The entire homes were wrapped in plastic and treated with gas. In Zilmere, a suburb adjacent to Inala, the infestation was so advanced that the imported houses had to be burned down. As Inala residents remembered, it was possible to see the glow from afar. I just quit very quickly. Anyways, the dramatic story, albeit a lesson in transnational design, represents just an episode of the many layers of the living suburb. As the paper suggested, by dissecting its many plans, typologies, materials, and labor networks, it is possible to contextualize the suburb within post-war Australian history and debates on suitability and sustainability of construction. By doing so, it hoped to inscribe histories of everyday environments such as Inala into architectural and urban design histories, usually oblivious to such projects. Thank you.
Allowed to push for another 5 minutes, so I'd like to open to the floor for questions. Can I invite Professor Philip Goad and Dr. Julie Collins here? And Maria, can you please stay there on the screen? So, any questions on this very overview? Yes.
Fantastic session, this one. I really enjoyed it. My name's Andrew Fatia. I'm a architect with ACAHUCH. We're a contemporary prefab company in Sunshine. Anyway, it seems the motivations for prefab have changed over the years, and there's this constant argument about, is it cost effective, whatever. But one of the key benefits we still see is the time for construction. So I'm curious, with the different systems you talked about, what's known about the construction time? And I know it's probably a bit of a difficult, not a straightforward thing, because there's the prefabrication time. There's the wild card here of often transit across the ocean, but then there's the installation on site and site works. Would you care to comment on that?
With Operation Snail, there were figures described in the research as the number of men to complete a number of houses in certain days. So I couldn't say a house a day, but they would talk about 70, I think it was from memory, 75 men could produce. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was that they were talking about the figures of how many houses could be produced in a week. The warehouse had 120 house bundles at any one time. That was the maximum. So there was always limited on how many bundles were in the warehouse and then going out. But I can't give you an exact figure.
I guess in the case of the quadruple unit prototype, it's really not relevant. And I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, and I don't think they announced that either. But the fact that it was too expensive is either going to be materials or labour. So yeah.
It's a good question, because in the press and amongst politicians, it wasn't necessarily the time, but the cost. And it was always compared against locally produced prefabs and conventionally built houses. So timing, although there was it was a priority, cost was the political thing discussed in the press.
Maria, any comments on time from your perspective?
I actually agree. It was a lot of discussion on cost, but I guess with a particular case I was looking at, it's also the timing was important. So the quicker you could assemble, the better it was. So,
but I thought in the case of South Australia, there was a very clear mention about one house a day.
Yeah.
Am I right? So
that was intended.
That was intended, though. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Very good question. Yes. Any other comments or questions? Paul?
I was very interested to see the Inala design, urban design. It strikes me as being somewhat dated, for the 1950s, and the other discussions of prefabricated housing we've heard today really don't pay a lot of attention to urban planning, and I wonder, given Ernst Fuchs, X-ray the city, based as it is, I think, on certs, can our city survive? There were these discussions in Australia of of neighbourhood units and what they meant, and the integration of schools and retail design into that. So, I mean, was Inala seen as dated, or kind of, and to the other speakers, where is the urban thinking in these schemes?
Okay. Maybe I'll start with Maria, and then we'll come back.
Yes, I think it's quite interesting because of its scale. It was planned as a more suburban development, so there was actually some urban thinking placed into it. But I agree, it does look, for the 1950s, it does look a little bit dated. But I think what is also quite interesting, how there are so many layers to this urban plan, suburban plan. So actually, at some point, with the Queensland Housing Commission, it transforms into this other plan that is focused around civic centres. So civic centres, schools, community buildings. So it actually moves from the Garden City principles to something else. But then, of course, there's question of suburban connections and the connectivity to Greater Brisbane, and that wasn't really working out. So I think it is interesting how the scale of the project and the materiality of it, the prefabrication, come hand in hand, because you had to construct this very large development very quickly. So there are implications for urbanism within this choice. But yes, I think it's quite an interesting question.
Yes, it's a very good question, Paul, because with the in the Yunkin Freeman archives, there are subdivision plans that go with all of these houses. So for Sunshine, for Portland, for parts of Maribyrnong, there are suburban plans that the number of houses in each place would number from around 8 to about 20. And they are basically additions to existing subdivisions. So the houses are actually spot located across a series of streets or cul-de-sacs. And generally the subdivision plans all show some form of community building within walking distance. Or in the case of Newborough in Gippsland, the English migrants arrived and their main complaint was that there was no school. So I don't think in the case of the Victorian Railways, there was a commitment to any coherent urban strategy at all. They were fitting often within pre-existing Housing Commission estates or land set aside by the Victorian Railways.
In the case of the South Australian Housing Trust, the imported homes which were shipped over here, they again were dotted around the various housing trust. They weren't even really estates. The Housing Trust was kind of almost doing infill development throughout the inner and later on the outer areas. And later in the 1950s, it would go along Newtown kind of principles to develop what were satellite cities, which are now part of the suburbs. But the prefab homes were just, dotted around where there were gaps. They were very much mixed in. And part of the Housing Trust development was that it was mixing in rent, purchase, as well as other buildings by local builders themselves.
Yeah, and sorry, the only exception would be Eildon, the whole new township master plan by Bates Martin McCutcheon, which was a classic post-war model town, walking distance to schools, shopping centres and the like.
Thank you. This very quick question.
Really, well, probably more comment. The urban part seems really interesting because of the contrast between material efficiency for the houses. And today we start talking in carbon terms about the sort of sufficiency of the road infrastructure. It seems like it was really wasteful, like there wasn't the same material thinking about how to minimize the amount of roads, whereas there was that for the houses. This contradiction seems quite interesting to tease out at another point.
All right, so I have to close here. We have a 10-minute break. I just come back here at actually it's a 5-minute break, very quick. So we have another session, but there might be perhaps scope with the closing remarks to recover some topics from these three wonderful and very rich presentations. So can you please join me to thank our contributors again?
And sorry, special thank you to you, Maria. What time is it?
4:30 when we started. So.
4:30 in the morning. Oh, well, we thank you very much. Thanks so much.